Boldwood presents Payback, written by Gemma Rogers and read by Georgia Maguire. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. September 2018. I didn't see the note when the post was delivered. I was later than usual and in a rush to open the agency. I'd thrown the collection of brightly coloured junk mail, leaflets and envelopes onto my desk to sort later. Frank arrived as I took off my blazer, the office already impossibly hot, and I hugged him, as I did every morning, enjoying the woody aroma that transferred onto my shoulder. He smelt like home, and I squeezed him tight, ignoring the pang in my chest as I was reminded our days together were numbered. "Morning, Poppet," he said, wrapping his arm around me. Frank joined the estate agency when my dad started the business in 1989. Around the time I was knee-high and playing with Barbies under the desks, hidden from the customers. Dad had a keen eye for business, and when we moved to the small village of Copthorne in West Sussex from South London, there was one estate agency who held the lion's share of the local market. Seizing the opportunity, he built the business from scratch with our family name over the door and learnt the trade. Creating an independent agency to rival theirs, and within a year, White's had been established as the premium place to market your home. Dad was a charmer, but he never cut corners, and it was his integrity that became the building blocks of the business, with customer service always his number one priority. Now I took care of it, since Dad had signed ownership over to me when he retired last year. He and Mum moved out of the 2-storey flat above the agency, and I moved in, as expected. It was strange moving back to the home I'd grown up in, but the memories were ingrained into the plaster. There was comfort eating dinner in the same kitchen I'd watched Mum bake my birthday cakes in. She and Dad had downsized to a 2-bedroom bungalow. At the grand age of 62, she'd already had a hip and knee replacement, courtesy of the NHS, and Dad wanted to be around more to look after her. They talked about going on a cruise, and Mum wanted to buy a beach hut at Lancing for day trips. I had big plans to expand the business and open another office in a neighbouring village, but even though he no longer technically owned White's, Dad had never fully let go. It quickly became clear that he still considered himself chairman of the board, and even though I'd worked in the family business for almost 10 years, I had neither the knowledge nor experience to match his. My ambitions were put on hold until Dad took more of a step back, or he decided I could be trusted to fully take the reins. So whilst I owned White's, Frank managed the day-to-day running of the office. He was in his late 50s and would be retiring soon, leaving a massive hole not only in my heart, but also in the White's empire, which was the reason I had 2 new starters arriving that morning. Gary was an experienced estate agent who worked for a competitor, a career-focused 30-year-old, unmarried man who had his sales patter locked down. He fancied himself as a bit of a Cillian Murphy look-alike, never without his Peaky Blinders flat cap. I suspected it was because he was going prematurely bald, but I couldn't be sure. I'd had my eye on him for a while. I'd heard customers liked him. He was smooth and easy to warm to. He modelled sharp suits in bold colours and came across a bit flash, but his sales performance at Osborne's spoke for itself. There were now 3 estate agents in the village, all vying for a piece of the pie. The initial independent rival was long gone and had been replaced by an established chain. Osborne's followed around 5 years ago, as the small village expanded. White's managed to hold on to the top position due to our excellent local reputation, something that Dad constantly reminded me I mustn't let slip. I'd managed to entice Gary with the pull of an excellent starting salary and the prospect of taking over from Frank in a few months. Often, basic salaries were unimpressive in the property business. If you wanted to earn, you had to sell. However, I learnt that paying peanuts often brought monkeys, and with a little extra incentive and a good working environment, I was able to retain my staff easily. My small team were loyal. They worked hard and, in return, were treated as extended family. There was a small Christmas and summer get-together every year, profit-related bonuses every quarter, and the only stipulation was honesty and integrity. All sales were above board, and there was no underhand dealing. My dad had run the estate agency the same way, and I was carrying on the mantle. The other addition to the team was Hope, a junior sales assistant. She'd previously worked in telesales fresh out of college and had no property experience. At 20, she was a blank canvas, ready for training, and wowed at interview. Confident and no-nonsense, she seemed much older than her years. The bell jangled, announcing Gary and Hope, who'd arrived together, just before 9. I greeted them with a welcoming smile and firm handshake. "Welcome, officially, to White's Estate Agents." "Thanks, Sophie." Hope slipped off her beige Mac and hung it next to mine on the coat stand. She was immaculately presented in navy blue tailored trousers and matching waistcoat over a crisp white shirt. Her almost black hair elegantly tied into a chignon. I looked away, smoothing down my red shift dress. Hope looked effortless. Her makeup was expertly applied, skin flawless, with perfectly sculpted eyebrows and a slick of peach-coloured lip gloss. Looking fabulous in your 20s was much easier than in your 30s, and she had youth on her side. Gary took off his trademark cap, hanging it beside Hope's coat, and flattened down his thinning hair. Oversized, garish cufflinks catching the light as he moved. Frank shook Gary and Hope's hands in turn and showed them to their desks. "I'll leave you in Frank's capable hands today, but I'll be around to sit with you both later and run through personnel details. Pension forms, formal identification, next of kin, and that kind of thing." "No problem," Gary replied, already digging his passport out of his satchel. "Can I get either of you a tea or coffee?" I asked, and once I had their preferences, I headed to the kitchenette at the back. I was always the first one to make the tea in the morning, not believing a hierarchy in the office was conducive to a pleasant working environment. Everyone was treated the same, from the manager to the cleaner. The bell clanged again, followed by voices, muffled in the kitchenette, but I knew it would be Beth, the office junior, and Lucy, another sales assistant. I chewed on my nail whilst I waited for the kettle to boil. I hoped Gary and Hope would fit in. It was imperative to have a team that gelled, one that would push the business forward. "Here you go." I put down the tray and handed out steaming hot mugs of caffeine to fuel the team. Everyone chimed their thanks and I took my cue, retreating to my office to check emails and get the latest property chain updates. Waiting for Microsoft Office to jolt to life, I fingered through the pile of post. Pizza delivery, window cleaners, a signed contract allowing Whites to market Mr. and Mrs. Green's bungalow on Tyndall Road, and lastly, a plain white envelope addressed to the owner. Likely a charity letter asking for direct debit details to support a child in Botswana or sponsor a snow leopard. But what stood out was the handwritten scrawl. Normally those kinds of letters had printed labels, mass-produced with no personal details at all. Interest piqued, I stuck my index finger into the tiny gap, tearing open the fold. Inside was a sheet of white paper, with a lone sentence in the middle of the page, written in the same hand as the envelope. "Who was your first?" My first what? First sale? First car? First boyfriend? Without hesitation, I ripped the sheet in half and tossed it into the waste bin, dismissing the note as nothing more than the marketing ploy of a local business to generate intrigue. A second later, my email came to life, and I turned my attention to everything I needed to action that day. Frank knocked on the door, even though it was open, one of his many quirks that he still did daily. I waved him in, ready to go through the schedule for the day. "We've got the bungalow on Tyndall Road. Can you block out some time to see if we can take photos today? Give that one to Gary and Hope can work alongside him," I said, holding out the contract for Frank to take. "Brilliant. Gary's going through what we've got on the books so he can get himself familiarised. I'm going to get Hope on the phone to everyone registered, see if they're still looking, introduce herself, that kind of thing." "Good idea. We can see if she's as good on the phone as her reference implied." "Thanks, Frank." "Oh, do you mind if I turn the aircon up? It's stifling today." "Sure, go ahead." I made a few calls to solicitors, chasing documents which were delaying an exchange of contracts. I spoke to most of the homeowners to give them an update on how much interest they'd had in their property. Keeping in touch with the clients was a high priority. The general public assumed that with websites like Rightmove and Prime Location, our job was easy, but securing properties, marketing correctly and fixing breakdowns in the chain was what earned us our 1.5% fee. Something the team worked hard for. Later that day, after I'd spent time with both Hope and Gary, the bell clanged, announcing the arrival of a lady in her late 60s, looking hot and bothered in a blue cardigan. Frank and Gary were out at the newly acquired bungalow. Lucy was on the phone, and Beth was wrestling with a jam in the printer. Hope got up from her desk to assist, striding towards the lady. My chest swelled. She was a natural, and I considered myself a solid eye for spotting talent. I glanced back to my screen, but the customer's agitated hand gestures caught my eye, although I was unable to hear what she was saying. "Can I be of assistance?" I smiled politely, poking my head out of my office. Hope's eyes blazed in my peripheral vision. A tight smile stretched across her face. "We keep getting leaflets every day now. We are well aware we've been on the market for a while, but can you please stop? Think of all the trees you're wasting." I guided the lady into my office, flashing a grateful smile at Hope, and invited her to take a seat. "I'm sorry, Mrs." I spied the gold band on her finger.
"Davidson, Mrs. Davidson."
"Mrs. Davidson. I'm very sorry, but I'm unaware of any leaflet dropping we've been doing recently. Could you tell me what road?"
"Park Lane. I'm at 32 Park Lane, and I'm on the market with Osborne's."
Mrs. Davidson rubbed the side of her temple, sighing. I let the address sink in, the flash of recognition catching me off guard. My stomach lurched. I'm sorry, do you have one of the leaflets?" I stammered, keeping my tone calm so as not to cause Mrs. Davidson any further distress.
"No, Gerald has thrown them all away, but they keep coming. I told him I'd come in and see you today, get you to stop."
"I do apologise, Mrs. Davidson. I will speak to the sales manager, but I haven't authorised any leaflet dropping this month." The woman unzipped her jacket. Her neck flushed. I was worried she was going to have a funny turn. "Can I get you something to drink? Tea? Some water?" Mrs. Davidson waved me away. "Let me assure you, Whites don't practice that kind of underhand behaviour with our competitors. I'm sure there's been some kind of mistake. If another is delivered, would you be so kind to keep hold of it so I can investigate?" I passed Mrs. Davidson a business card. Her eyes darted around the office, her forehead crumpling into a mass of lines.
"But I'm sure they had the Whites logo on them," she said, more to herself than to me.
"It's fine, Mrs. Davidson, it's no problem. If it is anything to do with us, I'll get it rectified immediately. We're always happy to help." I smiled. Did this lady have all her faculties?
OK, thank you, Sophie, she said, lifting the business card to check my name.
I walked her to the door. Hope was on the phone and looked at me quizzically.
Sell a lot of houses, do you?
Mrs. Davidson asked on the way out. I stepped onto the street with her as she surveyed the property particulars displayed in the window. Clear plastic cases, filled with houses for sale, hung with gold wires in a 4x4 pattern. 16 properties in the main window, suspended beneath the swirly black logo my dad had created when he started the business. Oh, we don't do too bad, I replied with a conspiratorial smile. I glanced up at the logo, wishing I could change the curly calligraphy to something more modern.
Would you come and have a look at ours? Let us know why we aren't getting much interest.
Her voice was small, the stress of selling her home plain to see. My chest ached, and I leant closer. Of course. How about tomorrow? Perhaps you can show me one of those leaflets, if you get another one through. Chapter 2, September 2018. After work, I took the team to the local pub, the Boar, to celebrate Gary and Hope's first day. The pub was nothing special. Part grimy wood flooring with a carpet that used to be red many years ago, sticky tables and toilets that flushed if you were lucky. It was dingy, stopping short of being uninhabitable, but it was within walking distance and it served alcohol and hot food, if you were brave enough. Gary regaled us with the antics his old firm would employ to ensure a sale was pushed through. Listening to it made me wince. His former employers were across the road, and I eyed the pub's clientele to make sure none of his old colleagues were in earshot. Hope sat in the corner, clutching her white wine, gazing absent-mindedly out of the window. She hadn't had more than a mouthful. "How was your first day, Hope? Still want to come back tomorrow?" I asked. Was she still upset about me stepping in with Mrs. Davidson? "It was good. Feels like I made the right decision." I eased back into my seat and drained my vodka and tonic. That's what I wanted to hear. I must have read too much into Hope's expression earlier. I didn't stay long. I bought another round but had to get something for dinner. My stomach was rumbling, but my fridge was as barren as my love life. When I left the pub, Frank was telling everyone how I used to leave him presents in his desk when I was little. Books wrapped in brown paper, a tin of buttons, any treasures I thought he might like. His eyes glinted, recalling the memories. When I was 10 and he was 34, I was determined I'd grow up to marry him, but I didn't share that with the team. I'd never told Frank either. He'd blush scarlet, I was sure. Now, he was a second father to me. The local co-op was busy, lots of singletons carrying baskets filled with dinners for one. I'd read in a newspaper supermarkets were one of the best places to meet someone, although no one looked attractive under those harsh fluorescent lights. I hadn't had much luck with the opposite sex. A few failed relationships, a string of married men I believed would be uncomplicated but turned out to be anything but. For the time being, I was concentrating on the continued success of whites. It was the only thing I was good at. Plus, I had a massive responsibility to ensure we made a profit. Failure wasn't an option. If I was going to flunk at anything, it would be producing an heir to the property empire. When I got home, I popped back into the office to turn off the lights, except for those above the property details in the window. Those lights were on a timer and didn't go off until 10 in the evening, allowing passers-by to see what was for sale. I locked up and headed upstairs to my microwave lasagna and salad. I'd missed a call from my mother, so once I'd eaten and changed into my pyjamas, I dialed the landline. "Sophie, I'm glad you called." "Hi, Mum, everything okay?" "I've had a call from Sue.
It's bad news. Gareth died in a car accident almost 2 weeks ago.
My blood ran cold, and I squeezed the phone, knuckles turning white. How? I asked, the hair on my arms bristling despite the temperature. Someone ran him off the road, apparently, going around a bend. Sue and Jim are devastated. Losing both your children, it doesn't bear thinking about. Mum blew her nose down the phone as I tried to take in the news. I hadn't seen Gareth for years, but there was a time when he meant a great deal to me. The reasons we'd grown apart seemed so silly now. Childish, even. But that's just what we were. Children. There was a long pause where I could hear Mum snuffling on the other end, but couldn't find the words. Are you all right, Mum? Is Dad? Yes, we're okay. Bit of a shock, that's all. Thought you'd want to know. You two used to be so close. Was he married? I blurted. No. He lived with a woman in St Albans, but they weren't married. I just can't believe it. Poor Sue. Burying both your sons. It's just not right. Your kids are supposed to outlive you. I could hear the rustle of tissues down the line. Mum and Dad had always been close to Gareth's parents. They lived a 10-minute walk away from the agency, and I'd spent pretty much every Saturday night there as a kid. Do you want me to come over? I asked, chewing the inside of my cheek, but they said they were going to have an early night. I felt bad for feeling relieved. I didn't want to get dressed and drive across town when I was ready for bed myself. We said our goodbyes and I brushed my teeth, retiring to watch television in bed. I'd promised myself I'd have a tidy tomorrow. The flat was starting to look like a family of 4 in residence instead of just me. I tried to focus on a documentary about adoption, but my mind kept slipping to Gareth. 36 was no age to die. Next day, at 11 a.m. sharp, Hope rang the doorbell of 32 Park Lane. I hadn't seen the house for years, and it seemed smaller than I remembered. But outside, everything looked the same. White metal-framed windows, the mostly glazed front door with its 70s leaf pattern. Even the enormous hydrangea in the sickly pink shade remained in the front garden. Hope had been keen to come along. She wanted to see the property through my eyes, learn why it wasn't selling. It would be a good experience, although the reason was obvious, to be honest. Osborne's had overpriced it. Mrs. Davidson took a while to come to the front door. I could hear muffled voices, and her silhouette grew larger through the glass as she approached. "Hello, please come in," she said, smiling and moving aside to let us through. I stepped into the hallway, which led to the kitchen. "Please go through," she gestured as I hesitated, overwhelmed at the interior, frozen in time, and just as I'd remembered. I walked into the kitchen, unable to stop the memories bouncing around my head. I came to a stop by the larder, taking it all in. The cream cabinets, the checkerboard linoleum flooring, the archway, all untouched by 20 years. It seemed like it had been an eternity, but I could still hear my friends' voices as they were then. "You okay?" Hope whispered, eyes narrowed. I nodded, forcing myself back to the present. "Did you manage to find one of those flyers?" I asked Mrs. Davidson as she came in to join us. "No, Gerald threw them all away and the bin men came early, before I had a chance to dig one out." "That's a shame," Hope said, grimacing. "Yes, well, never mind. We haven't had one yet today, so perhaps that's the end of it. Right, would you like to have a look around? Feel free to have a wander, and I'll make some tea." "That would be lovely, thank you," I said, moving straight towards the stairs. Gripping the wooden banister, I inhaled the unique scent of the house. Every home had a different aura, a different aroma, ingrained into the walls and carpets. The occupants would never know it was there. They were blind to it. But Park Lane smelt faintly of blossom with a hint of bleach. I climbed, taking in the green striped wallpaper and beige carpet until I reached the top of the stairs. Every door was open, but I headed instinctively to the master bedroom. It seemed so much smaller. But I was grown now. I moved between the rooms, Hope hovering a few steps behind, roughly calculating the size and condition of each. Pushing the memories to the back of my mind, I tried to view this house as just another potential listing. "Well," Hope said, her voice low so as not to be heard downstairs. I turned to her on the landing. "I haven't seen downstairs yet, but basically it's overpriced. It's in need of modernisation, new windows, new bathroom and a new kitchen. The house hasn't changed for 20 years and it's putting prospective buyers off," I said, gesturing for Hope to go down the stairs. I followed behind, and we looked around the ground floor. Gerald, Mrs. Davidson's husband, was in the den, a smaller version of their lounge, watching rugby. He gave an odd salute as I glanced inside. The room felt ominous, not helped by the wood panelling. I couldn't wait to get out, practically thrusting Hope out of the way. "Oh, it's oppressive in here," I whispered, but Hope didn't answer. The archway remained, and so did the ghosts. We sat down for tea at the dining table, drinking from a teacup and saucer. Pink wafer biscuits had been placed fan-like around the edges of a floral-painted plate. I explained to Mrs. Davidson that the property had been marketed incorrectly. "If I may speak plainly, Osborne's are marketing your property as a family home, which it is, of course it is, but the price they're asking for, and the modernisation required, is what I imagine will be putting families off. You need double glazing, a new bathroom, and although it's well decorated throughout, the amount of money required to bring it to the standard of other properties currently available means any buyer would be spending over the odds." I pulled some particulars from my bag of similar properties, and Mrs. Davidson leafed through them. "Well, thank you, Miss White, for being frank," Mrs. Davidson said after a pause through pursed lips. I knew I wasn't going to be delivering good news, but there was little point in sugarcoating. She didn't strike me as the sort of person who liked having her time wasted. "I'm sorry, I understand it's not what you want to hear, but that's my honest opinion. I think if you ask Osborne's to lower the price to include the next bracket too, that would increase interest." I finished my tea to be polite, even though it was still a touch too hot and burnt my tongue. After thanking Mrs. Davidson for her time and the tea, Hope and I left, walking around the side of the house to see the back gate I'd used all those years ago. "Well, that seemed like a waste of time," Hope said, her hands on her hips, eyebrows raised. Easy to see she was a rookie now. "Perhaps, but honesty's the way forward. When Mrs. Davidson finally loses all confidence in Osborne's, she'll call us, and we will take her house on with open arms. This afternoon I'll get you to make a few calls. There's some people I know who look for refurb projects, quick turnarounds." I lingered at the gate, casting my eye over the garden before moving on. "Have you been inside there before?" My core tensed at the question. Some memories, although partially good, were best left undisturbed. "No, first time," I lied. Chapter 3. August 1997. It turned out to be easy in the end. I'd spent all night worrying how I was going to do it, not to mention totally freaking out about the whole plan. I'd convinced myself I was ready, but as the minutes ticked closer, I wasn't sure. It took forever to fall asleep, and when I woke up, Mum was in the lounge, glued to the television, her arms wrapped around herself. I could tell something was wrong. It was Sunday, yet there was no blissful smell of bacon frying and no rustling of tabloids from Dad's chair either. Instead, I found Dad with his arm protectively around Mum as she dabbed away tears with his hanky. Lady Diana had died in a car crash in Paris, and the country was in mourning, the BBC News presenter reported gravely. I was never going to get a better opportunity, and it had to be done today. They were so absorbed by the television, I was easily able to take the office keys and slip downstairs unnoticed. I was in and out in 2 minutes, knowing exactly where I'd find them. Dad had a wooden box locked in his desk. You couldn't be too careful, he'd told me, as I watched him hide the box behind a fake panel in his drawer on Friday after closing. The box housed the keys of all the properties for sale. I found the one I was looking for easily. The address written on the brown tag in my dad's scrawl. I swallowed down the guilt, which threatened to spill, and slipped them into my dressing gown pocket underneath a mound of tissues. Dad didn't open the estate agents on a Sunday, so I knew I'd be able to put it back before he'd notice it was missing. It didn't make me feel any better, though. I'd done some things before, pranks mainly, which I'd got into trouble for. Occasionally I'd been grounded for back-chatting or failing to tidy my room. But nothing like this. This was a different league altogether. It couldn't have been more perfect. The planets had aligned. All of us had agreed, and everything else had fallen into place. I just had to hold my nerve. I crept back upstairs, my legs like jelly. I'd done it. I'd managed to steal the key, and my parents hadn't moved from the sofa. A loud gurgle came from my stomach. I'd have to get my own breakfast this morning. Sophie! Diana's died. It's awful. Those poor boys losing their mum at such an age. Oh, they're so young, Mum wailed from the lounge as I passed by. I didn't go in. I needed to hide the key. Plus, I didn't want to see Mum crying or Dad consoling her. It was terrible. The devastation of the general public leaked out of the television. She was beautiful, and the princes would grow up without a mum now. But I couldn't understand why my mum was getting so upset. Wasn't like she knew her, was it? I forced a bowl of honey nut loops down, ignoring the palpitations which fluttered in my chest as I went over the plan for tonight. We were all meeting at 7 by the postbox towards the end of my road. Then we'd make our way to the house, go through the back garden and in via the kitchen door. That way we'd be hidden from the main road and no one would report a group of kids going into an empty house. Everyone was bringing a sleeping bag and a torch. Elliot had suggested bringing candles, but there was no way. What if someone burnt the carpet? They were all under strict instructions not to smoke or drink anything in their house. I didn't want to leave any evidence we'd been there. The detached house was devoid of furniture, a shell waiting to be sold, but it was a perfect location for tonight. The owners had emigrated to Spain, so there was no chance we'd be caught by them. Sometimes, if Dad knew the owners wouldn't be there, he'd take me along when he was getting a house on the market. I'd help measure and he'd take the photos, all the time telling me the business would be mine one day. I'd smile and nod, but it wasn't what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be a journalist, like that Kate Sanderson on Newsround, at the forefront of the action, reporting from exotic locations. I wanted to travel the world, but first I had to pass my geography GCSE. We were going into Year 11 in a couple of days, preparing for our GCSEs next summer, and the life we wanted beyond secondary school. Robin, Becca and I had been friends since the first year. We were middle-of-the-road kids, not nerds or outcasts, but not cool enough to be the popular ones either. We left that to the blonde bitches. It was our name for them, although Robin always took offence. Her hair was the perfect shade of gold, and the rest of us envied her for it, although, of course, we didn't tell her. Hayley joined in Year 9. Her father was an officer or something in the army, so she was always moving around, never settling anywhere. As an only child, she was scarred by years of conveyor belt friendships that rarely lasted. Woodfield was the first non-army school she'd been to, as her mum didn't want to live in the garrison anymore. I'd no idea what she meant. Robin lived around the corner from her, and one morning they struck up a conversation as they walked to school, and from that day she was part of the middle-of-the-road gang. The plan had all started with the blonde bitches, a group of 3 girls I likened to the witches in Macbeth. They were who I pictured when Mrs. Perce read Shakespeare's words aloud, hunched over a cauldron, their faces as ugly as their insides. Of course, they weren't unattractive. Quite the opposite. They were sickeningly pretty, and all of them had boyfriends in the year above. They thought they were, in Becca's words, the dog's testicles. They teased us mercilessly, snide comments before being shoved out of the way in the corridors. The word virgin had started to be thrown around as an insult. It stuck in our throats. It was obvious they'd all copped off with their older boyfriends. You could tell by the way they carried themselves, strolling around with an air of superiority that they'd moved to the next level. Engaging in adult activities, drinking, smoking weed and having sex, whilst the rest of us watched on, wishing we could upgrade our boring lives, worried we were being left behind. When school broke for summer, it hung over us, and we didn't want to leave secondary school with 0 sexual experience, which was what we all had. There'd been some snogging, mainly at our classmate Jimmy's birthday roller disco party. We all thought it would be lame, but it ended up being brilliant, with lots of dark corners and distracting flashing lights. The kissing followed on from all the hand-holding we were doing with the boys, who were trying to keep us upright as we skated in circles to Free by Ultranate. But that was the sum of our experience. Us girls had chatted about getting the whole thing over and done with. We had no boyfriends, no boys we even fancied that much. Except for Hayley, it was obvious she had a massive crush on Gareth, a friend of the family who was in our year. I'd known him since we were in nappies, apparently. Hayley wouldn't admit it, but her scarlet cheeks whenever his name was mentioned told us all we needed to know. Because my parents were friends with Gareth's parents, I often got dragged along if they were invited over for dinner on Saturday night. We'd sit in his room and play Nintendo, disappearing upstairs as soon as we'd finished our meal, desperate to get away from the olds. Thankfully, there was no awkwardness between us. I thought of him more like a brother than boyfriend material, and that suited me fine. I was an only child, so the idea of a brother was something I relished. Gareth had a brother, Craig, who was 2 years older than us. I rarely saw him. Gareth said he only came home to sleep and eat. One evening, early in the school holidays, we were hiding out, playing Mario Kart, listening to Gareth's mum get louder and louder the more wine she drank. "She's so embarrassing," he said, gritting his teeth. I put my controller down. Bowser's cart sped off into a ditch with a loud crash. "She'll get worse until he takes her to bed. Then I'll have to listen to them do it through the wall. It's gross," Gareth admitted, giggling. I noticed the tips of his ears turning pink. "Have you ever—" I asked, my face flushing red. Gareth shook his head and looked at a speck on the carpet, unwilling to meet my eye. "What about your mates, Elliot, James and Mark? Have they?" I pried. "I dunno. Don't think so." We were both quiet for a while. Gareth picked up my controller and handed it back to me, signalling to carry on with the game. "What if your friends and my friends all, Did it? Gareth's head spun around like I'd slapped him. Together? No, not together, you moron, not like an orgy. I meant if we all paired up. Get it over and done with. Do you think they'd be able to keep something like that quiet? Because it would have to be a secret. I spoke slowly, concise, not quite believing what I was suggesting. What I was proposing sounded far too grown up to be coming out of my 15-year-old mouth. Gareth's mouth was still hanging open until he realised I was waiting for an answer and promptly closed it. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, but I could tell from the blotch of red skin on his neck that he was excited. I guess so. I mean, I'm sure they would. Do you want me to speak to them? Yeah, okay. Ask them. Anyone blabs, though, and it's off, I said, my voice unwavering, but my stomach somersaulting with excitement or nerves. I wasn't sure which. All right, shitbag. A white hacky sack with red stitching bounced off Gareth's head and into my lap. A sneering Craig was stood doubled over in the doorway. Piss off, Gareth hissed, his face turning crimson now. How long had Craig been standing there? Had he heard? Craig nodded a greeting in my direction, and I nodded back. He was dark like his brother, cropped hair and good-looking, well-built and already filling out beneath his tight T-shirts. But he had a meanness to his eyes, magnified by his pointed features. He disappeared down the hallway, and Gareth got up to close the door. He just got his first car, so he thinks he's the big I am. You'll be like that one day, I laughed, rolling the hacky sack around in my hands. Craig couldn't have heard. He wouldn't have resisted an opportunity to torment Gareth if he had. How would we pick who's with who? Gareth asked, returning to the conversation. I considered for a second, chewing the inside of my cheek. Well, I dunno. Names out of a hat, maybe? It has to be fair. You can't choose. Gareth's face sagged, and he turned back to the game. Who did he want to pick? Suddenly there was an awkwardness where it had never been before. We'd been playing in his room since we were tiny, but for the first time, the atmosphere was charged. I pretended I needed the toilet to get out of there. Had I made a terrible mistake, coming up with the idea? Would the whole thing be around school before we even started the new term? The idea of the blonde bitches getting hold of it made me hyperventilate. If this was going to work, we couldn't tell anyone outside of the group. The next stage was convincing my friends to do it. We'd spent a lot of time talking about it, but talking about doing it and actually doing it were two different things. Chapter 4, September 2018. As we left 32 Park Lane, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease Gareth's death had brought with it. A blanket of foreboding attached itself to my shoulders, and I carried it with me, hunched over from the weight. The news seemed to thrust old memories, long forgotten, to the forefront of my mind. We could have walked a different path if I'd changed my mind back then. When Hope and I returned to the office, I told the team I had to make some calls and retreated behind the comfort of my desk. Closing the door, a sign to be left alone, safe in my sanctuary to gather myself. I typed Gareth Dixon into Google to see what popped up. There were a few hits for a consultant, LinkedIn and Facebook profiles, but there was one from the local paper reporting the accident. The article was brief and gave very little details, other than Gareth had died in a car accident, and they were appealing for witnesses to come forward. My shoulders sagged as I bent over the desk, finding the website for Interflora and ordering some flowers to be sent to Sue and Jim. They were like a second set of parents to me as a child. their home as familiar as my own. My mobile rang, vibrating loudly and skittering across the table. I jumped at the interruption. The number was withheld, but that wasn't unusual. I slid my finger across the screen to answer. Hello, Sophie White speaking. At first, I didn't hear anything. I strained my ears, just about to end the call, but then I heard a clicking sound, and a man's voice spoke. Sophie. She was the one. I was crazy about her back then. There was a cough, and the line went dead. Hello? Hello? I dropped the phone, and it bounced on the floor. That voice, weirdly familiar. Who was it? It had to be a joke. Not that it made any sense. I tugged my blazer around me. Was the aircon turned up too high, or was it the hint of something that ran through my body, turning my veins frigid? I had to get out, go for a walk and clear my head. I told Frank I was popping out and took off down the road, striding at a pace to stamp out the thoughts that spiralled. I wandered around the village, on a tour of all my old haunts, places I hadn't visited for years because I no longer had any reason to. The post box at the end of the road where we used to meet, the park, and then Robin's house. Afterwards, I made my way to Becca's, and then to Gareth's, whose parents were the only ones still living in the same place. I almost knocked, but the sight of their closed curtains changed my mind. They were grieving, shut away from the world, and I didn't want to disturb them. I carried on walking, unable to remember the exact house Hayley had lived in. So many had been painted or had extensions built that it was hard to distinguish which one was hers. Gradually, the sun began to fade, and it was time to head back, my head filled with happier times. Frank was the last one left in the office, and I caught him as he was locking up. "You all right, Poppet?" he asked, eyes narrowed. "Yeah, one of those days. An old school friend died at the weekend. Mum rang me yesterday. It's weird how it brings back old memories I'd forgotten." "Bad ones?" he asked. "No, not all bad." I squeezed his shoulder and sent him home. His wife, Diane, would be waiting with something warm in the oven. My mobile rang again, and I fumbled in my pocket to get it, my stomach sinking. I made sure I was inside the office with the door locked and lights off before I answered. "Hello? Sophie?" A lady's voice this time, not another prank call. "Speaking, how can I help?" "It's Mrs. Davidson, Judith. I've taken the house off the market with Osborne's. I tried to speak to them about lowering the price, and the salesman told me I didn't know what I was talking about." I listened intently. I knew if she gave them enough rope, they'd hang themselves. "So, I'd like you to take it on. Shall we agree a price of £375,000? How does that sound?" "Yes, it's more in line with what I was thinking, Mrs. Davidson. That way it catches everyone looking up to 400,000. I believe offers in excess of that, what Osborne's were asking, is not realistic in today's market." "Perfect. I'll pop in tomorrow to make it official. Shall we say 10 a.m? "Of course. I'll have the paperwork ready for signing," I agreed. Mrs. Davidson ended the call, and I chuckled. She was a force to be reckoned with. The week flew by, and on Friday morning, Gary had arranged 5 viewings for 32 Park Lane, 3 of those being property developers looking for a fast turnaround. The only issue with that was, even though they had no chain and were cash buyers, they often wanted the property at a knockdown price. Having a bigger profit at the end of it was what enticed them to buy, after all. Mrs. Davidson was happy with the progress, and a cream "for sale" board with White's logo took pride of place at the front of her garden. I'd sent Gary and Hope to take the photos and measurements. I had no intention of going back to that house any time soon. Jesus fucking Christ! Hope crashed through the entrance to the office, hopping from one foot to the other, a takeaway coffee cup gripped in one hand. Hope! I hissed, my nostrils flaring at her outburst. Thank goodness it was a little too early for customers. Sorry, she lowered her voice. I tried to conceal the laugh that was forming in my throat. She looked like a princess who had trodden in feces. What is it? A rat, that's what. A bloody rat. On the doorstep. I just stepped in it. Disgusting. Hope kicked off her high heels and stomped barefoot to the kitchen. I shook my head. Rat? What rat? I'd come in the back way from upstairs, so hadn't been out front yet. It wasn't until I opened the door to the street I saw the carcass of a dead rat, mouth hanging open and pointy little teeth on show. It was laid across the concrete below the step up into the agency, bloody and flattened like it had been run over, a gash exposing its entrails. I took a step back, my hand over my mouth, bile rising fast. It's okay, I'll deal with it, said Frank in a calm voice as he came in, stepping past me over the threshold, managing to avoid what Hope had not. What the fuck? I hissed, leaning back on Frank's desk. There was no way that rat had just decided to croak at my door. It had been killed and placed there for my benefit. Who would do such a disgusting thing? Osborne's. It had to be Osborne's. Revenge for stealing Gary and taking on Park Lane. I was too old for childish bullshit. They wouldn't have dared pull a stunt like that with my father in charge. Grabbing my blazer from the peg, I thrust my arms in, white-hot flashes blurring my vision. Where are you going? Sophie, don't do anything rash, Frank called, clutching a bin bag as he emerged from the kitchen. I didn't answer him, leaping over the rodent corpse and storming up the street. A minute later, I was banging on the door of the estate agents, who were yet to open. When Colin, the branch manager, answered, I pushed past him. He looked half asleep, clutching a mug of steaming hot coffee. I was tempted to tip it over him. Sophie, always a pleasure. Please come in, and good morning to you too. The sarcasm dripping in his voice. What the fuck, Colin? Aren't we past this kind of juvenile behaviour? Because trust me, you don't want to go to war with me. I'm one crazy bitch, I spat. I must have looked mental, wild-eyed and ready to blow. The vein in my forehead throbbed. I've got no idea what you're on about. Did you forget to take your meds this morning, or what? Smarmy little shit. I scowled, balling my hands into fists to stop myself lashing out. But I hadn't failed to notice the genuine confusion on his face. The rat? Are you telling me that wasn't you? No. I have no idea what you're talking about, he replied, scratching his receding hairline. Although Colin had previously employed underhand tactics on occasion, he'd never stooped so low before, and I didn't think he was lying. Without another word, I turned and marched out of the office, walking around the block until the rage began to disperse. If it wasn't Osborne's trying to engage in some kind of ridiculous turf war, who was it? Was it someone trying to mess with me? First the weird phone call, now a dead rat at my door. Had someone got a vendetta against me or White? I racked my brain, going around in circles. Who had I upset? No one came to mind. There was a reason why I ran the business the way I did, to avoid all that kind of shit. Had I insulted someone unintentionally? Was someone trying to scare me? I was too angry to feel scared, but the rat hadn't just decided to die on my doorstep. Someone had delivered me roadkill. Who would do such a thing? I was mystified and still none the wiser when I returned to the office to find Frank had removed it and rinsed away the evidence from the pavement. I called a quick team meeting to allay any fears that we were being targeted. And I apologise for all the swearing. Thank you so much, Frank, for taking care of the rat. How are your shoes, Hope? She wrinkled her nose and eyed her stiletto. I don't think there's any more rat guts on them, which got a laugh from the rest of the team. Well, we carry on. Business as usual. If someone has an issue with whites, the best way forward is to push on, sell more, and not engage. Everyone went back to work, and Frank took me aside in the kitchen as I made tea. Was it Osborne's? He whispered. No, I said. Sure it wasn't. Colin's bewildered expression told me he had no idea what I was talking about. Is there anything I should know, Sophie? Frank's brow furrowed. No, Frank, and please don't mention it to Dad. Then who was it? I knew he was concerned. There had never been anything like this when my father was in charge. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Chapter 5. September 2018. On Saturday morning, I called a security company to install a discreet camera at the front of the agency. Something that would not be obvious to the general public. A small white dome on the edge of a fascia board, connected to my Wi-Fi so I could view the exterior through an app on my phone wherever I was. No one was going to be able to pull a stunt like that again and not be recorded. I hadn't reported the dead rat to the police. Frank had cleared it quickly and I hadn't thought to take any photos. I was more focused on ensuring it was moved before any customers arrived. Saturdays were busy. We opened until 1 o'clock, but functioned on a skeleton staff, taking turns who worked from one week to the next. I had Lucy and Hope with me in the office to field customer inquiries, and the morning was busy with people coming in off the street who wanted to register. We handed out property particulars like sweets, and I had to get Hope to print some more and restock. I received a cheeky offer from a property developer who'd been to see 32 Park Lane. It was $20,000 under the asking price, so I was reluctant to give Mrs. Davidson the news. Luckily, Hope booked a second viewing. A young family who were keen to visit that day. They weren't put off having to modernise as they needed a bigger house but were struggling to find anything within their budget. Hope asked if she could handle the appointment and I was happy for her to go. I was confident Hope could manage it and I was only on the end of the phone if she needed me. Second viewings were often a formality, a time for measuring and deciding what furniture would go where. The decision to buy was made the first time a family entered the house. Can you let Mrs. Davidson know that she's had an offer? Tell her how much it is, but tell her not to rush into agreeing anything. We're aware it's a low offer and hopefully we'll be lucky with this second viewing. We could have another offer for her on Monday. I didn't want Mrs. Davidson to accept anything less than what the house was worth, and I knew the developer was chancing his arm. At midday, there was a lull in traffic, and I retreated to my desk to eat a sandwich I'd grabbed from the supermarket. I hadn't slept well all week. Thinking about Gareth, and then, last night, every time I closed my eyes, I saw rats. Their dead eyes staring up at me accusingly, as if I'd slaughtered them. It was niggling me, as I had no idea who would have done such a horrible thing. Whoever it was must hate me or whites, and that made me feel vulnerable. I was living alone, in a flat above my place of work, but I was also the one in charge of the business. Sometimes the enormous sense of responsibility overwhelmed me. When that happened, my dad would have to talk me down from the ledge. I wasn't sure I wanted the family business and all the history that came with it. The pressure to succeed, to keep turning over money for a family I may never have. Ironically, since I took over, there'd been no time for dating anyway. But it was my name above the door. My dad's name, and his before him. I owed it to them to try my best.